Blog Talk Radio.
I'm Deepak Chopra. Tune into my program Deepak Chopra Radio on Blog Talk Radio. I'll answer your questions on health and well-being, relationships, success, spirituality, consciousness, anything that is of importance to a civil society. This is Deepak Chopra, and you're listening to Blog Talk Radio. And today it's my great delight to welcome as our special guest Rupert Sheldrake, Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, whose new book is called Science Set Free, 10 Paths to New Discovery. This book is published by Random House. It has been published in England under the title The Science Delusion. Rupert Sheldrake is somebody I've admired for more than 2 decades, and I have been a follower of his writings for the last 25 years or so. And each time he writes, he takes his thinking to the next level of insight. That's the only word I can use. And this book is very timely because it basically ends up or starts with the conclusion that what we are now seeing as mainstream science, reductionist, materialistic science, is really based on dogma, belief, a certain kind of ideology, and perhaps even superstition. So I'd like to start off right away, and the book is available in all bookstores. It's also online, and you can go to any online bookstore to get it. You can find links to it through deepakchopra.com and many other social networks that we will link to after this talk. So, Rupert, thanks for joining the show today.
It's a pleasure, Deepak.
First of all, I'd like to ask you, what was the reason you wrote this book at this particular time? You've been writing about topics related to this, but now you're addressing current mainstream science head-on and saying it's more belief and dogma than science.
Yes, well, the reason I think for taking this comprehensive approach was that I questioned several of these dogmas in the past. The taboo against psychic phenomena, the belief that the laws of nature are fixed, the idea that memories are stored in the brain. But what I'd found was that many scientists were unable to question these dogmas because they were part of a much larger worldview. Over and over again, people said, if I take this seriously, it means the whole of science must be wrong, and therefore that's so improbable that, we have to reject these ideas. I realized that actually there's a consistent worldview, a consistent ideology underlying so-called mainstream science, and that unless one brought it into consciousness, it was going to be very difficult for people to see what was wrong with it. I think science is stuck because it's stuck in a belief system which most people in science and outside science don't realize is a belief system. They think other people have belief systems and they know the truth. The fact is, it's a belief system, and it was a matter of making that explicit. And then questioning the beliefs, showing that none of them stand up very well as science.
You're listening to a conversation with Rupert Sheldrake. His new book is called Science Set Free, 10 Paths to New Discovery. It's now available in bookstores and online, and you can also order it through deepakchopra.com. So, Rupert, let's move on, because I've engaged with scientists too on these topics, and the first thing they say is you got here by a jet plane, and that is because of science. We are having this conversation, you and I, because of the technologies that science have made available to us, and life has become very much more comfortable than it was, say, in the Middle Ages or even a few hundred years ago, thanks to science. But what you're saying is that science is much of it is incomplete. And would it be fair to say that because it's incomplete, we have created technologies that are good for us, but also we have created problems for us, the extinction of species, climate chaos, radical disparities in economics across the world, the destruction of the ecosystem, and now capacities of mechanized death that threaten not only our extinction, but loss of life on our entire planet. So we urgently need to address a more holistic and more expanded science. Was that your intention? First of all, do you agree with this?
Oh, I do agree with that. I think that the achievements of science and particularly technology are huge. And the reason that most people take science so seriously is because of these impressive achievements. And we're all impressed by them: jet planes, the internet, computers, and so forth. What those are really are technologies. And modern science is based on the idea that everything is mechanical. Well, the machine theory is a wonderful theory if you're building machines. It gives us a tremendous ability to make machines, and machines that work phenomenally well and beyond everyone's dreams 100 years ago. But the problem is it doesn't work very well for things that aren't machines, and that means practically all of nature. And the only things that are mechanical in nature are man-made machines, and they occupy a tiny fraction of reality. So I think that the defects are where this machine theory is applied to minds, brains, bodies, nature, ecosystems, and so on. It simply is too simplistic. It's incomplete. I agree with you. It's an incomplete theory, which is assumed by most people to be a complete theory in principle. And that's the problem. It's a kind of half-truth.
You're listening to Rupert Sheldrake talk about his new book, Science Set Free, 10 Paths to New Discovery. The book is now available in bookstores and in online stores, and you can also order it through deepakchopra.com. Let's, Rupert, go over the 10 core beliefs that most scientists, in your view, take for granted. Let's take them one at a time. So let me read from your book. Here are the 10 core beliefs that most scientists take for granted. Number one, everything is essentially mechanical. Dogs, for example, are complex mechanisms rather than living organisms with goals of their own. Even people are machines, lumbering robots, in Richard Dawkins' vivid phrase, with brains that are genetically programmed computers. So let's talk about that. We are not computers because we have insight, intuition, inspiration, creativity, free will. All these would go out the window if we thought that life and we, as biological organisms, are essentially mechanical. Would you comment on that?
Yes. I think this machine view, you see, is something that came in the 17th century. Then it was kind of liberating. What people believed in Europe when modern science was founded in the 17th century was that nature was organic, that animals and plants were true organisms, that people had spiritual souls embedded in animal souls, embedded in formative souls that shaped the body. It was a complex organic system. This machine theory was a radical simplification that made science easier to do in its earlier stages. But it's a radically incomplete view, and the reason it's incomplete is that organisms have their own purposes and goals. Machines don't. If you get in a car, it'll go wherever you want it to go. It's a machine. It doesn't have a purpose of its own. If you sit on a horse and try to ride it, the horse may well have its own ideas about where it wants to go. I was in the Grand National recently, the British horse race. The favourite, called Synchronized, was extremely misbehaved and simply wouldn't go to the starting post for 10 minutes. That's because it was an organism, not a machine. So I think the machine theory, originally, it took all designs and purposes out of nature and put them in God. It created a new kind of theology, this mechanistic science, a kind of mechanistic theology, and deprived all of nature of meaning and purpose. The result was it led to a very impoverished view of life. Humans were the exception to start with for the first 200 years because they were supposed to have a spirit which was non-material, totally different. But this was confined to human beings. Animals didn't have it. Nothing else in nature had it. So it was an extremely foreshortened view, a simplified view that gave 17th century science something to get their teeth into and detach science from religion. It split off religion and science. And it liberated science. It also impoverished religion because it confined religion to the spiritual life of humans and the whole of nature, the stars, the planets, animals, plants, the earth, was given over to this mechanical science, which is simply an inadequate way of looking at nature. It's good for making machines, but not for understanding the world. And science since then has got stuck in a simplifying view which was very appropriate in the 17th century to liberate science and to get things going, but it's now become a kind of prison within which scientific thinking is stuck. It impoverishes our view of ourselves and of nature, and the results, as you pointed out, are disastrous.
Mainstream scientists, by and large, those who are wedded to the reductionist, materialistic, mechanical view of even biological organisms and nature, do deny, like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and many others, that we have free will, that even creativity is an illusion. Is that correct? I mean, does Dawkins think that when he's arguing a point of view, he's compelled to do it? It's basically his neural networks that are doing it?
Well, of course, he doesn't think that, but he should think that according to his own theories. I mean, the worst thing about the mechanistic science is that it's dishonest. It means that scientists say that people's minds and brains are just computers, that consciousness does nothing except act as a kind of meaningless shadow that goes on around brain activity. Everything's caused by physical events in the brain or by chance events. That's the worldview they put forward. The brain is like this deterministic computer with a bit of chance thrown in.
Yes. So, Rupert, we were saying that thinking of human beings and biological organisms as complex machines that are pre-programmed actually deprives us of everything that we call our own humanity and deprives us of free will and also of creativity and imagination and insight and self-reflection and self-awareness, things that are very dear to us and therefore in a way creates a worldview that, as you said, is very impoverished and leads to problems, leads to separation, leads to conflict, leads to destruction of the ecosystem, leads to unsustainable technologies, and leads to conflict as well. We are now in a phase of our understanding of science where we need to expand that science, which is what your book is intended to do. It's not anti-science. It's just saying science set free, 10 paths to new discovery. The book is available in bookstores, online, and through deepakchopra.com as well. Let's move to the second tenet in your book, the second core belief that you question. All matter is unconscious. It has no inner life or subjectivity or point of view. Even human consciousness is an illusion produced by the material activities of brains, a view propounded very much by, say, Daniel Dennett and Susan Blackmore, that our minds, our consciousness is the illusion. Now, of course, you have the extreme opposite view in Vedanta, where matter is the illusion, and this whole problem of what we call the hard problem in science, as David Chalmers has spoken about, is how do we explain subjective experience through a physicalist ontology? And there is a worldview which says that, all we experience are these qualia in the form of sound, touch, sight, taste, smell, feelings, emotions, images, thoughts, and that the total gestalt of these experiences is what we call the material world, and that includes the brain and the body. I'd love to know your thoughts on this, because, we can't have a dualistic worldview. It seems that's not tenable anymore. The materialistic, non-dual worldview is what our scientists are proposing, a lot of them, but as you state very eloquently in your book, matter seems to disappear into the quantum vacuum with virtual particles, so that doesn't seem tenable, which leaves us only with a non-dual consciousness. I'd love to know your thoughts on this.
Well, again, to understand the present view in science, it's necessary to look at the historical background of it. Before the 17th century, people thought that everything in nature was animate, that everything was alive in Europe. The mechanistic theory in the 17th century said, no, the world's made up of dead matter working mechanically, and minds are separate from that. God, angels, and human minds are non-material, non-physical. And that's called Cartesian dualism, of course, the dualistic view that minds are separate, but only human minds. The animals are supposed to be unconscious machines. What happened then in the 19th century was that the materialists said, well, there's no such thing as God, angels, or these immaterial human minds. It's all just material. So consciousness has to be explained as a product of the brain. That leads the materialists into the hard problem, the kind of problem that Daniel Dennett and people are trying to explain. How can you explain the existence of consciousness if matter that it's supposed to emerge from is completely unconscious? So that they've created this problem for themselves by trying to collapse an impossible dualism into a single thing, materialism. Idealism does the opposite, of course. As you mentioned, it says everything is mind. My own view is that this dualism is a false dualism. There's a kind of implicit mentality in all material things that some materialist philosophers are now beginning to say, well, there has to be some kind of elementary mind in atoms and molecules, there has to be some kind of mind through all nature. Otherwise, how can you explain the appearance of human minds? So I think the problem they're trapped in is a problem created by this historical development, first denying that matter has any kind of mind, mentality, or consciousness, except for human minds, and then denying that human minds are different from anything else. I think the only way forward really is to accept there's some kind of mental activity in all self-organizing things. And this was the view that Alfred North Whitehead took. It's the idea that he was the great 20th century philosopher, British, who then moved to America. And he thought even electrons and atoms had some kind of mentality, that the mental pole was to do with the future, the physical pole to do with the past, that mind and body were related not as inside and outside, but as future and past. Minds are concerned with the futures, possible futures. That's their main activity, not in advanced meditation, but most of the time the activity of minds is to do with choosing among possible futures. And as soon as you've made a choice, it becomes a fact, and that's in the past. So I think that this doctrine that matter is unconscious, which science is based on, traps scientists into thinking that the entire universe, the stars, the galaxies, all the other planets, everything else on this planet is unconscious, that we, for some peculiar evolutionary reason, have become conscious, but our consciousness doesn't do anything. That is the worldview that most scientists have, and I think it's a deeply unsatisfactory one. If we take the idea that material systems can be conscious, then all sorts of new questions come up. For example, the sun is a complex material system. Could the sun, in some sense, have a mind or be conscious or be aware? Now, you can't ask that question within materialist science, but nevertheless, it's something that all traditional cultures have taken very seriously. and I think is something that would give us a completely different view of nature if we think of the sun and the solar system as a kind of organism with a kind of mind, and even the whole galaxy as being like an organism with a kind of galactic mind. We may be embedded in a world which is full of minds. Ours is one among many, and ours has certain important essential qualities that other minds don't have. But it's not as if the whole of nature is unconscious and we're the only beings with conscious minds, plus perhaps a few of the higher animals. So I think one has to move to a more expanded view of the nature of mind and its relation to material systems.
I'm speaking to Rupert Sheldrake, and we're speaking about his new book, Science Set Free, 10 Paths to New Discovery, published in the United States by Random House in England under the name of The Science Delusion. The book has received excellent reviews, and my friends, Dr. Rudy Tanzi, who's a neuroscientist at Harvard and the head of neuroscience and genetics at Harvard Medical School, is reading it, and he called me this morning to say this is extraordinary that he, being a neuroscientist, understands that consciousness is not a product of the brain. How could it be if we can actually rewire our neural networks simply by thinking, reflecting, and feeling? And so too about our genes, that they're not totally deterministic because we influence the activity of our genes through our behaviors, through our exercise habits, our rest, activities, relationships, emotions, environment all play a role. And Rupert, you just said something that reminds me of similar statements made by great scientists like Freeman Dyson, who says that every quantum experiment forces a subatomic particle to make a choice, and that therefore mind is embedded in every level of the cosmos, from the subatomic to the cosmic. And even Sir Roger Penrose, who recently has said that at Planck scale space-time geometry, all we have left is a field of possibilities, and that at this level everything is quantum entangled, and that includes mind itself. And, many others, John Wheeler, Heisenberg, have expounded that same worldview. So I don't know what went wrong in the last few years where everything became unconscious, because this does, as you said, open new vistas for us. It reminds me of Rumi's poem where he says we're not just the drop in the ocean, we're also the ocean in the drop, and that this worldview enriches our own experience of not only the sacred, but how we can create the future. Henry Stapp, who worked with Heisenberg and who's become a good friend of ours at the University of California in Berkeley, says that every choice we make actually influences the evolution of not only our own biological organism, but ultimately the evolution of the universe. So what you're saying has huge implications.
Yes, I think it does, and I think that as all these great physicists you've mentioned have realized that quantum physics has moved us on. I think the problem is that biology and psychology have remained stuck in a kind of 19th century physics. They're trying to reduce the phenomena of life and mind to physics, but the physics they're trying to reduce it to is a physics which went out of date 100 years ago. It's partly because most biologists don't know any physics. They study biology, not physics. So I think that's part of the problem. And I think some of these insights about possibilities in quantum theory are absolutely key. I mean, the way that people calculate what electrons and atoms do is through equations that give all the possible things that system could do. An electron at this moment, every electron at this moment has a penumbra, a whole range of possibilities open to it. And when something happens, when it's measured or when it interacts with something else, when one in your brain interacts with a nerve cell membrane, all those possibilities collapse down to one thing, which is often called the collapse of the wave function, because the wave equation gives all these possibilities. So I think minds are rather like that. They're filled with possibilities, and when we make decisions, they collapse down to a particular decision, a thing that then becomes a fact. But there's always this range of possibility, and that is present even in electrons. So I think this mind-like aspect of matter permeating all nature, which physicists have begun to glimpse, but which most biologists and psychologists haven't even begun to think about, is because they're stuck in a very old-fashioned kind of materialism, and that is really holding science back and holding our whole educational system back too.
Where could a possibility exist in the material plane? I mean, possibility has to exist in a mind-like realm, and that is implying a mindful, living, conscious universe, as you said earlier. Let's move to the third dogma that you questioned. The total amount of matter and energy is always the same, with the exception of the Big Bang, when all matter and energy of the universe suddenly appeared. This is a big one. You're questioning the basic laws of thermodynamics and the basic laws by which science has survived all these years, and it's something no one questions. So talk about that a little bit.
Well, I didn't question it myself until I started writing this book. I'd questioned all the other dogmas of science. This was the one that I thought might be true. And in a way, I wanted to find one dogma that was true, because it would have sounded biased if I had found that all 10 dogmas turn out to be false. So I actually quite wanted this one to be true. But as soon as I began to think about it, I realized that it's the most questionable of them all. Anyone who's done physics at school has learned the law of conservation of matter and energy. The total amount of matter and energy is always the same. But physics itself has ignored this, or at least they've not taken it too seriously. In the last 30 years, the total amount of matter and energy in the universe has increased enormously through the recognition of dark matter and dark energy, which now make up 96% of reality. The matter and energy we learned about at school is less than 4% of what's actually there. The remaining 96% dark matter and dark energy has a nature that is literally obscure. No one has a clue what dark matter and dark energy are. So we don't know whether they're conserved. We don't know if the total amount's the same or not. And the total amount recognized by physics changes from year to year as physicists adjust their equations, and they add in more or less dark matter to make their equations balance. And can that be converted to regular matter and regular energy? Nobody knows. So we simply don't know whether the total amount of matter and energy is always the same. Also, in the quantum vacuum field, which is, according to quantum physics, supposed to be a vast ocean of energy on which the world we know is like waves on the surface of the ocean, a vastly deeper ocean of energy. All that extra energy is recognized by science, but can we tap it? There are all sorts of people who make so-called above-unity devices and free energy machines, which are totally taboo from the conventional scientific point of view. They're supposed to be impossible. But the inventors often claim they're tapping one of these other forms of energy that science now recognizes, but doesn't take very seriously. I think we're in a position where we simply don't know, and the answers to this question could have profound implications. There could be other sources of energy that would totally transform the world's economy, but the exploration of them is ruled out by this very powerful taboo within science. And this is another area where a dogmatic way of thinking is severely limiting science itself.
You know, this morning I corresponded with Joel Primack, who's an astrophysicist. He's actually one of the authors of the double dark theory of the universe, including dark matter and dark energy. And I posed this question to him, and I sent you his response, by the way, by email, and you look at it. But this particular question about is the total amount of energy and matter constant, because after all, he himself states that the amount of energy is increasing. And, I think he had not thought of this question. He kind of said yes and no. And he said on the surface, it seems that the laws are violated, but if we include gravity as a form of energy, then as the dark matter and dark energy increases, it changes the gravitational force and so on and so forth. But, what you raise is very important questions for science. We simply don't know. And even 4% that is the atomic universe, it seems, according to Joel Primack, most of it is hydrogen and helium and interstellar dust, which hasn't yet formed stars. The visible universe, with all of its galaxies and billions of stars in all these galaxies, is actually 0.01% of the atomic matter that is there, and the rest is unknown and much of it unknowable. So what you raise is very important questions for science, and particularly the possible practical aspects of it, that we may have an inexhaustible source of energy to tap into in the future as these technologies emerge, if and when they do emerge. So let's move to your fourth dogma that you question. The laws of nature are fixed. They are the same today as they were at the beginning, and they will stay the same forever. Now, you've questioned that for many years. You've, in fact, the first one to suggest that what we call the laws of nature are habits of nature. And, from my personal experience, habits are difficult to break, but they can be broken. So do talk about that and its implications.
Well, again, the belief that the laws of nature are fixed is not something that scientists have proved through complex experiments with results accurate to many places of decimals. This is an assumption that was built into science for historical reasons. Most of these dogmas are legacies of outmoded philosophy, often Greek philosophy, which has had a huge influence on Western thought and still has relevance today, but we've in many ways moved beyond it. And the ancient Greeks thought that that nature was ruled by timeless laws or principles. Pythagoras thought it was timeless mathematics. Plato thought it was Platonic forms or ideas, which are timeless ideas outside space and time. And the founders of modern science thought that the whole of nature was ruled by transcendent mathematical laws, which were ideas in the mind of a mathematical God. Well, it was a kind of theology. Many of them are now atheists and don't believe in God anymore, but they're left with these timeless mathematical laws that are supposed to be the basis of everything. In the 19th century, scientists thought the universe was eternal, but when the Big Bang theory became orthodox in 1966, then the question arose, what about the timeless laws? Were all the laws of nature present at the moment of the Big Bang, like a kind of cosmic Napoleonic code? Or have they evolved like the rest of reality? And as soon as you think about it, the very concept of law of nature is questionable. It's anthropocentric. Only humans have laws. Only civilized societies have laws. And much more organic, in accordance with an organic, evolving universe, is habit. And habits, as you say, are very deeply entrenched when they're more often they're repeated, but they can change, and they're not all there to start with. So what I'm proposing is that the so-called laws of nature are more like habits that evolve along with the universe. There's a kind of memory in nature. Things are not just governed by mathematical laws somehow outside time and space, but by an evolving memory, evolving laws within the evolving universe, which I think makes more sense of the whole phenomena than the timeless law idea.
Would you say, and I'm kind of going out on a limb suggesting this, that a miracle, so-called miracle, is basically a shift in the habit of these nature's behavior? Or you would
it sounds
not
a little
comment?
bit too much the idea of a miracle as God intervening to suspend the laws of nature. I myself think that so-called miracles are not so much necessary shifts in habits or suspension of laws as dependent on principles that we don't yet understand. The point about a habit universe is that for evolution to take place, there have to be habits, but there also has to be creativity. There have to be new things happening. And in a sense, the creative, which the whole of evolution depends on, the whole of the creative evolution of human life depends on creativity. That, in a sense, is one of the miraculous aspects of the world, because we can't explain creativity in terms of habit, and yet we know it happens. Evolution would simply get stuck in grooves of habit and become endlessly repetitive without it. So I think there's always, in the whole of evolution, right from the very beginning, an interplay of habit and creativity. And the creativity, I think, is the working of the spirit, the creative spirit in the whole evolutionary process. And it's not something you can reduce to repeatable scientific law. It's inherently free and unpredictable.
I like that very much. As a physician, I've always been interested in the whole phenomenon of spontaneous remission. In almost every illness, there are documented examples, including some types of cancer. As a member of the Noetic Sciences Institute, you know that we have a whole directory of these, and there are now other published case reports. And I would like to think of remission in disease as a break in habit of a disease or a biology, as biological creativity. It makes much more sense to think of that, and then to understand what were the various situations and circumstances and events that led to that creative response in biological organisms. I am speaking to Rupert Sheldrake. His new book is Science Set Free. It's available in all bookstores and on online bookstores. Subtitled 10 Paths to New Discovery. The book is very extraordinary. It has received enormously good reviews all over, and is definitely destined to change the way we think about science. Let's move to the next dogma that you question. Nature is purposeless and evolution has no goal or direction. Two things here. I've been speaking to some of our friends recently who are engaged in the new discipline called quantum biology, and they are also suggesting that biological organisms are basically teleological, and that there is something called the reversal of entropy, that biological organisms behave in a way that's thermodynamically uphill. It reverses the law of entropy in many ways. You're saying much the same thing in your book, aren't you?
I am. What I'm saying is that most things in nature are purposive. Living organisms are purposive in many ways. When a hungry dog is hungry, it looks for food. When a bird starts building a nest, and it's building a nest and it lays its eggs in it. There's this purposeful behavior, which of course we have too. Humans have purposes, and yet conventional science says there are no purposes in nature. What's in fact resulted from this is that scientists have had to keep reinventing ways of explaining purpose in nature while pretending that they're not. People have had to smuggle purposes back into nature, and the commonest way in genetics is through the concept of genetic programs, which are, by analogy with computer programs, are purposive. Or selfish genes, Richard Dawkins' favorite phrase. These genes are purposive. They're ruthless as Chicago gangsters, as Dawkins puts it, struggling to compete and mold matter and shape form.
Well, that in itself is a statement of purpose, right?
Exactly. It's itself a statement of purpose. So the point about mechanistic biology is that it's inconsistent. They can only get away with it by smuggling purpose back in. And within the modern term used for purposive behavior is attractors. This is a term borrowed from dynamics and physics, where systems are pulled towards a future goal. And this, as you say, is coming into quantum biology. There's this purposive behavior in quantum biology. It's now being recognized within biology. It's recognized in developmental biology. So scientists are having to smuggle purpose back in, having denied it or pretended it doesn't exist. So again, this is where the ideology causes a terrible inconsistency. They're stuck in an ideology by abandoning that ideology, that dogma, science can become so much more rational and involve so much less in the way of dishonest pretense.
You know, one thing that I've begun to realize is that when we speak in materialist science of structures, whether they're genes or whether they're neurons or whether they're molecules, we're actually taking snapshots of an activity and then calling it a thing. You know, the universe is an activity. The biological organisms are an activity. Mind is an activity. And just like when you measure a wave, you see a particle, and that particle is actually a space-time event in your own consciousness. You call it a thing out there. You're actually creating something very artificial. And therefore, materialist science is based on looking at the universe as a noun when, in fact, it's a verb. You know, what's his name? Hans-Peter Duer, who was the former director of the Max Planck Institute, and he was at our institute a while ago. He doesn't even use the word subatomic particles. He calls them HAPS, H-A-P-S, as happenings or space-time events in our own consciousness, and that every act of perception is actually like taking a photograph and missing the essence of the spirit, which is constantly in motion with memory and creativity, as you say.
Yes, exactly. I think that this is something that quantum physics has shown, that reality is a process, it's not a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Old-style materialism was based on the idea matter's made up of little bits of stuff, atoms which were supposed to be like hard billiard balls that just persisted through time. We now know that atoms and everything else are structures of activity. They're vibratory activity. And because everything's ultimately made of waves, it's ultimately a process. You can't have a wave at an instant. It can't be a wave unless it's had time to go through at least a wavelength of activity. And that's why there's an uncertainty in quantum theory. You can't pin things down to exact positions and things because they're made of waves. And everything in reality is a process, and many of these processes are moving towards ends or goals or purposes. And so, again, this is an example of where so-called scientific thinking is stuck in a dogmatic formulation, which is 200, 300 years out of date. Quantum theory's already burst out of it, and when we recognize that this has happened, I think it'll transform our view of biology and indeed medicine, because purpose and goals are essential to all living organisms, indeed, I think, all of nature, and must play a part in the healing process as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm speaking to Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, and we are speaking about his new book, Science Set Free, and the book is available in all bookstores now and also online bookstores, and you can quickly order it through deepakchopra.com if you want, or go directly to any of the online bookstores. It's an extraordinary book, a breakthrough book, and you'll be hearing a lot about the new science as Dr. Sheldrake is expounding on it with such eloquence and speaking to great scientists who are actually beginning to question their own dogma. And it looks like current mainstream materialistic science may be based on the superstition of materialism, if that's a word we might want to start understanding. Rupert, we have little time left, so I want to go into the next three ones again very quickly. Minds are inside heads and nothing but activities of the brain. Memories are stored as material traces in the brains, in brains, and are wiped out at death. Unexplained phenomena such as telepathy are illusory. You know, I've mentioned our friend Rudy Tanzi many times, and he recently had a conference with 150 neuroscientists, top neuroscientists from all over the world at Harvard. And I called him and I said, I just want you to ask one question of all the neuroscientists out there. Where is memory stored at a chemical and cellular level? And I wanted to poll each one of them, and he came back and said, don't know. So you are on to something very powerful here. If memories are not in our brains, then where are they? If the mind is not inside the brain, then where is it? And that would definitely lead to the next question, which is telepathy all a phenomenon in the non-local mind? So can you address these three dogmas right now?
Yes, well, let's start with memory. It's been taken for granted by materialists that memories are stored in the brain, because if the mind is nothing but the brain, then memories, which are part of the mind, have to be in the brain. They have to be material. They have to be molecules or modified synapses at nerve endings or something like that. This is unquestioned not only by most neuroscientists, but also by most people. Most people take it for granted memories are inside their head. But I think this is a complete misconception. People have spent 100 years within science trying to find memories in brains, and they've come up with the answer that you've just said, we don't know. They can't find them. Over and over again, the memories prove elusive. I think that's because they're not there. I don't think the brain is working like a video recorder, storing all the information inside it. I think it's working more like a TV receiver that's tuning in. It's a tuning system, and memory works by resonance from the past. Now, this is a hard concept to grasp, because what I'm suggesting is that memory is a resonance across time. When you remember something, you resonate with yourself in the past. And you resonate with yourself because you're more similar to yourself. You also resonate with other people in the past. You get a more blurred kind of collective memory as well. But your individual memory is the sharpest and most important. So the brain doesn't actually store the memories, it tunes into them. If you went to somebody's house and you wanted to find out what they watched on TV last night, and you analyzed the wires and transistors, you wouldn't find any trace of what they'd watched last night, because that's not how TV works. And in the same way, I don't think you can find traces in the brain of what people have remembered, because that's not how memory works. And that's why there's been a repeated failure to find memory traces. That means when brains decay through degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, or when you have brain damage, you can get loss of memory, not because the memories themselves are being destroyed, but because the ability to tune into them is being reduced. So what I'm suggesting is that the mind is not confined to the brain in time or space. Memories are tuned into from the past, and it's a direct resonance. In the present, the mind is not confined to the brain. When you look around yourself, when you look around you, you see rooms and trees and chairs and furniture and all sorts of things. All those images, according to regular science, are supposed to be inside your head. Light moves into the eyes, changes happen in the brain, and you create images or representations inside the head. I don't think they're inside the head at all. I think they're where they seem to be. I think we project out the images of what we're seeing to where they are. Light comes in, changes happen in the brain, and we project out those images. And so the simplest act of vision, of perception, involves an outward projection of the mind. And in a sense, our minds touch everything we look at. That means if I look at somebody from behind and that person doesn't know I'm there, my mind's reaching out to touch her, and she may feel it and turn around. And of course, that kind of thing, the feeling of being stared at, is very common. Most people have that experience. So I think that the mind is not confined to the brain in space or time.
Mm-hmm. You know, I've tried this so-called experiment with some of my audiences. I tell them, can you tell me what you had for dinner last night? And they'll say, oh, I had a pasta, and then ask them, where were you? And they start to have a qualia experience, and they start describing the whole scene. And then I say to them, then if I went inside your head, do you think I would see those pictures? And, of course, the answer is no. You know, you can look inside the head now with functional MRIs, and all you see is electrical phenomena. So where is the experience happening? And, you know, nobody is able to answer that question. And what I was thinking is, and of course then you can go beyond that and say, do you remember the house you lived in when you were a teenager, and they can see it and so on, or do you remember the last time you saw a beautiful sunset when you were in Hawaii, and they can see that. And you know what I realized is that experience was, and that memory was not in the brain. It's much like a wave before it's measured. You know, when you measure a wave, it's a particle right here. Or when it's measured, or when it interacts with other waves, then it's a particle right here. And so too, until the moment you recall a memory, it exists as a possibility, and being a possibility, it is wave-like. It's everywhere. And then what you would call your field of morphic resonance. And then at the moment of actualization, there's a brain correlate to it. But until then, it's non-local. And being non-local, outside of space-time, it's basically indestructible. And that's the matrix, you might say, of our personal, collective, and universal memories that are recycling as a form and phenomenon, and in a way also serve as the template through which creativity emerges, because creativity is using those memories and creating a new context, a new meaning, and new experience out of that. And it fits in with what you're saying. I'm just looking for validation here.
Well, I agree. What you put it very clearly, Deepak. I think that your description of this is a good way of seeing how modern science is beginning to reveal to us that there's a lot of non-local influences. Things are wave-like. The old material picture of hard stuff doing everything is simply out of date. I mean, we've moved on, and yet the ideology hasn't. And this has very big implications for all sorts of things: psychology, learning, education, and of course the freeing the mind from the brain, recognizing the brain is not all there is very liberating, because if you are nothing but your brain, you're imprisoned inside your skull. You're basically isolated and separated from other people. And no wonder depression is one of the leading mental disturbances in the modern world, if people are brought up to believe they're just isolated inside their skull. Yet the extended mind view gives a quite different view. We're interconnected with the world around us through every act of perception. We're interconnected with the past and with other people through memory. And we're interconnected with other people through our social bonds. And this brings us to the ninth of the delusions, the delusion that psychic phenomena are illusory. The reason that scientists, many of them, say that psychic phenomena are illusory is not because they've looked at the evidence, it's because they haven't looked at the evidence, and because they believe the mind is inside the brain, therefore intentions and thoughts can have no effects at a distance.
Well, let's come to the last and final dogma that you questioned, which is actually my favorite, so I left it out for the last because, I have been a physician all my life and specialized in neuroendocrinology, and realized very earlier on that mechanistic medicine, in fact, most of the time did not work. Today we know that 85% of our pharmaceuticals are quote-unquote of optional or marginal benefit, that coronary artery bypass graft doesn't prolong life in more than 2% of people with stable angina, and that, angioplasty in none. So, and we also have this new field that, coronary artery disease can be reversed, that biological organisms are activities that can go both ways, and that there are other modalities that influence biological healing. And so the paradigm that you are creating is very much something that would be welcome to all of us involved in integrative medicine.
Yes, well, you see, I think the problem for modern medicine is that although it's very successful in certain areas, drugs and surgery can be very effective in many cases.
In acute illness, yes.
Yes. It's not very effective in a whole other range of phenomena, especially those that involve the mind, belief, social connections, and so forth. Religious faith, spiritual practice, prayer, meditation. Not very effective in all those areas because it's based on the same ideology as the whole of the rest of science, namely the materialist theory, which rules out any power of the mind and emphasizes only a kind of old-fashioned view of the nature of matter. So I think that official medicine's got locked into this ideology, not necessarily because it's the fault of doctors, it's because they're trying to be scientific. And so they borrow this ideology from the rest of science. So the science delusion, the dogmas of science, which are holding science back, are imprisoning medicine and trapping official medicine in this limited position. Whereas there's all these alternative and integrative therapies and approaches around which millions of people take part in because they seem to work, which are excluded from official medicine as much as possible by the ideologists because they don't fit this mechanistic model. But one can't treat medicine in isolation, and that's why I think that setting science free from these dogmas would have a liberating effect on medicine. That's the way it would affect our lives most directly, because doctors are just trying to be scientific, so they go along with the standard dogmas of science. If those change, I think it will have an enormously liberating effect on medicine.
You've been listening to a very enlightening conversation with Rupert Sheldrake about his new book, Science Set Free, 10 Paths to New Discovery. And this book is now available in all bookstores and also online bookstores, and also can be ordered through deepakchopra.com. Rupert, you are definitely a very brave person. In academia, you know, in the old days, if you were around the time of Galileo, they would have considered burning you at the stake. Today they just say, you're fired. It's the same thing. And you know, our materialistic paradigm is so strong that when we don't think something's important, at least in the English language, we say it does not matter. So I think the time has come where we explore these paradigms not necessarily in academic journals, which are really a club of their own, but put it out there for the public to really start questioning these dogmas and questioning the paradigm that science operates in, at least much of academic science operates in today. It was, after all, Darwin did not publish his Origin of Species in an academic journal, but put it out there in a book. And some of the major revolutions in science have occurred as a result of questioning dogma. And now we are living in a very interesting age where the social networks have become part of our global brain, and that we can start a conversation that catches the attention of the public, of lawmakers, and also of interested academics. And slowly that conversation starts to reach critical mass, and then sooner or later the paradigm shifts. What is your hope with this book, which I think is going to have a long-term life, and we need to keep bringing attention to this book through programs like this, through conversations on the videos, on social networks and YouTube, but also conversations with skeptics and mainstream scientists. So what is your hope with this book?
Well, the hope really is, as the title says, is setting science free from these dogmas in which scientists have become stuck. And setting all of us free from the dogmas because they affect all our lives through politics, industry, the educational system, which takes them for granted. And setting scientists themselves free from these dogmas. Many scientists don't believe in the materialist ideology. They don't believe in it in their private lives. But when they're at work, they pretend to believe in it simply because they're afraid of being thought weird. I think what will really change science and medicine is that when the large numbers of people who are aware of these limitations come out of the closet and feel free to speak to their colleagues about what they've really experienced themselves, what they really think, I think that would have an immensely liberating effect. And I think the change could happen quicker than we might imagine. It's not just going to happen through very slow piling up of evidence. The evidence is already there that the present worldview is much too limited. It's a shift in perspective, but a social change too, people feeling brave enough to talk about it to their colleagues.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, and we will continue this conversation in the future. You've been listening to Rupert Sheldrake talk about his book, Science Set Free, 10 Paths to New Discovery. The book is available now in bookstores and on online bookstores, and also through deepakchopra.com. Rupert, thanks for joining me, and we'll be talking about this again because this is, as I said, a very important conversation, and a lot is at stake: the future of our humanity, the future of our planet, and the future of our children and grandchildren. And so we indeed must set science free.
It's a great pleasure, Deepak, a great pleasure.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
I'm Deepak Chopra. Tune into my program, Deepak Chopra Radio, on Blog Talk Radio. I'll answer your questions on health and well-being, relationships, success, spirituality, consciousness, anything that is of importance to a civil society.